Hi everyone, you're watching BL Story of Love, the channel that brings you forbidden BL stories you just can't stop listening to. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story. That night, the industrial district looked like the city had forgotten a whole piece of itself there. Rusty bridges, warehouse hangars behind deaf fences, a few lonely streetlights with muddy yellow halos. Between all that, one bright rectangle of light sliced the darkness with neon. The club sat in a former workshop, and heavy music pulsed out of its narrow windows like the beat of an oversized heart. The air outside was warm, sticky, full of tobacco smoke and the breath of people who were not ready to go home yet. Elias came there late, closer to midnight. A day and a night of shifts clung to him with the smell of disinfectant and blood, tight shoulders, and that empty kind of exhaustion that neither sleep nor coffee could really fix. At the clinic, he was Dr. Hale, the man whose word decided whether a flat line on the monitor would stay flat or start moving again. There, he had no right to let his voice shake or his hand doubt. Here, at the door of the club, all that white coat armor felt unnecessary, almost ridiculous. In the cloakroom, he left his coat, and with it, the last clean smells of the day. On his wrists there was still a thin trace of antiseptic, but already in the hallway another world rolled over him. Alcohol, sweat, sweet omega scents, expensive alpha perfume, excitement, laziness, boredom, all of it mixed into a dense cocktail that hit the head harder than any whiskey. He put on the mask automatically, the way he put on gloves before surgery. Black matte plastic covered half his face. It erased his cheekbones and the familiar line of his mouth from the reflection. In this club, a mask was a rule, no extra recognition, no real names, only conventions and agreed-on signals. A world where, for a few hours, you could stop being who everyone expected you to be. In the main hall, screens flickered and light sliced the crowd with broken stripes. Electronic bass pressed people down to the floor again and again. Alphas and omegas moved in the half-dark, caught each other's eyes, passed by, leaving behind trails of scent and intention. Some came here for a quick release, some to play at being untouchable. Some simply did not want to think about tomorrow. For them it was a normal Friday ritual. For Elias it was a rare attempt to run away from the feeling that his whole life existed only in the corridors between operating rooms. He walked past the bar, feeling eyes linger on him, but he did not respond to any of them. He didn't need conversation. He didn't need a loud, laughing company. He needed a little space where no one would say his name 100 times a day. At the back of the club, behind a heavy curtain, the VIP zone began. It was filled with softer smoke and half-light. The music there was quieter, the lights warmer and dimmer. That was where he saw him. The Omega sat by a low table, leaning back into the couch as if he was holding on not to life, but to that thin piece of comfort. A silver mask covered the upper half of his face, leaving his chin, lips, and throat open. Light slid over the metallic surface and hid in the hollows. The line of his shoulders spoke of tiredness, not the staged, lazy pose of someone showing off, but the kind that comes after a long, heavy day. In his hand he held a tall glass. Ice cubes chimed inside it too rarely to call it real drinking. He did not stand out with bright clothes or provocative behavior. Against glittering outfits and bold movements, his modest, almost closed clothes looked out of place, but that was exactly what pulled the eye. In the way he sat, there was a strange mix of caution and stubbornness, as if he had come not for an easy game, but because staying home would have been worse. Elias realized he had been looking in his direction for several minutes already. The mask, of course, hid part of the face, but the eyes always gave away too much, even when you only saw them in passing. In that way, the Omega's gaze slid across the hall, over people. There was a learned habit of noticing everything and never showing what was going on inside, and when those eyes met his, briefly, purely by chance, there was no request and no flirt in that intersection. There was a quiet question. Come on, Elias thought, hearing the familiar inner doctor's voice grumble about boundaries, about responsibility, about how he had no business looking for comfort in places like this. But another voice inside, softer and more stubborn, whispered that if he didn't allow himself at least one night of being just a body and not only a function, One day he would simply break, somewhere in that white corridor. The Omega looked around the hall again and let his gaze rest on Elias a little longer than on the others. In that little longer, there was everything. Agreement. Willingness to try. A careful attempt not to show how important this choice was. He did not smile. He did not invite him with his body. He only tilted his head slightly, as if silently agreeing to something Elias hadn't yet said out loud. Elias walked over. The music swallowed most of the words, and they didn't need many anyway. This club had developed its own system of signals long ago, understood by those who had been there more than once. A look. A motion of the hand. The distance someone allowed you to come. All of that replaced any, "What's your name?" or "What do you do?" None of it mattered here. When he sat down next to him, the air between them changed. Through alcohol and smoke, another scent slipped through, more delicate, a mix of nervous adrenaline, a light floral note, and omega biochemistry that sedative pills had not completely drowned. Elias felt his own body react too fast, as if someone had stripped off a layer of protective filters. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry, and tried to keep his breathing steady. The omega was tense, but he didn't pull away. His fingers squeezed the glass a little tighter when Elias's knee brushed his leg. It was neither a demonstrative refusal nor an easy game. It was the reaction of someone who had learned to expect a hit from the world and still stayed seated. There was more courage in that quiet stubbornness than in all the loud poses around them. "Let's go," Elias muttered, surprised by how rough his own voice sounded. He wasn't even sure if he had said it out loud or only with his lips. The answer was a short, almost invisible nod. The omega set the glass down very carefully, as if he was afraid of spilling not the drink, but the last pieces of his composure. Then he stood up and let his fingers touch Elias's elbow, so as not to get lost in the dark. That tiny gesture of trust hit Elias harder than any obvious invitation. The corridor to the private rooms was narrower and darker. The music there was muffled. The light shifted from red to soft gold. The walls swallowed most of the noise, leaving only a distant bass and the sound of their own hearts. Elias heard the omega's slightly quickened breathing beside him and suddenly realized he was breathing just as unevenly. In their usual lives, everything was measured by numbers, protocols, charts. Now the rhythm was set only by their steps in a shared nervous beat. Inside the small room there was nothing extra, a soft couch, a low table, a shadow pushed back into the corner. No photos, no mirrors, no little details that could betray anything real. Only two masked men who, for a few hours, had had their names taken away and their bodies given back the right to be just bodies. The first touches were awkward, not because they lacked experience, but because both of them were too used to holding themselves under strict control. Fingers moved over fabric, testing whether they would be pushed away. Breaths caught when someone allowed a bit more. There was no falseness in that uncertainty. It was honest caution from people who had long been denied the right to be weak. Under his hands, Elias felt the omegas trembling. Not the theatrical kind, but the real one that made you want to say, "It's okay," and believe it yourself. His own muscles were tight, trained for precise measured movements. But here, he wasn't measuring doses, wasn't calculating risks, wasn't thinking about how any of this might look from the outside. There was only the warmth of another body and the quiet thud of a heart, pressed a little too close. When it was over, they sat for a while, foreheads resting together, as if they were trying to find balance in a world that kept tilting. No one asked for a name. No one promised to meet again. The law of this place was simple. Whatever happened under the neon masks stayed there, dissolving with the dawn. "Enough," Elias told himself later, standing in his own shower while hot water washed away sweat, the smell of the club, and another person's salt from his skin. He scrubbed his hands as thoroughly as if he had just left an operating room. Even though there was no blood on them, the metal mask lay on the edge of the sink, reflecting a distorted fragment of his face. He avoided looking into that reflection for more than a few seconds. In the morning, everything fell back into place. White corridors, straight rows of lamps, neat stacks of charts. In the ER, it smelled of coffee and latex. In the ICU, of antiseptic and fear. Elias became Dr. Hale again, the man whose hands decided whose pulse would keep going. The night at the club slid to the back of his mind like a blurred frame. It was better not to replay. Only sometimes, when his gaze lingered for a second on someone's profile, or he caught a familiar hint of scent in a hallway, a strange, faint tension stirred inside. An image floated up, an omega in a silver mask, a stubborn stare, fingers trembling on a glass. He honestly believed he would never see him again. And of course, he could not imagine that their next meeting would happen not in the half-dark walls of the club, but under the bright lights of the ICU. The morning started like hundreds of others. Gray light seeped through the windows of the intensive care unit, dissolving into the white of walls and ceilings. Elias flipped through the night shift report with a habitual motion, marked a couple of worrying trends in his head, nodded to the head nurse. He drank his coffee on the run, burning his tongue and not tasting it, between one door and another, between two short sentences about doses and prognosis. ICU days were always counted not in hours but in conditions. Stable. Getting worse. Transfer to the ward. Resuscitation measures. There were no empty slots in his schedule, only names, numbers, and arrows. That day followed the usual, almost calming track. Rounds, adjusting treatment plans. A few brief clarifications about lab results, until the call from the ER. The voice of the attending physician over the intercom was tight and collected, without extra details, but from the tone alone Elias understood. This would not be a normal day. A multi-car accident on the highway. That same endless gray strip of asphalt he only ever saw through his windshield. Several cars, wet road, a flipped delivery truck, one car in a ditch. The word several in reports like that almost always meant too many. Ambulances began arriving one after another, like uneven notes in an overloud piece of music. The ER filled with familiar chaos. Damp street air, blood on stretchers, screams from those whose pain still let them talk, gurgling from those already sliding into their own darkness. Against that background, Elias's calm voice giving orders sounded almost artificial. He moved between stretchers the way you move along a route you've walked 100 times, a quick exam, a score on a scale, a decision, who needed the OR first, who could go to ICU, who had been lost before the ambulance even turned toward the hospital. In moments like that, he didn't let himself think in terms of people, only bodies, functions, chances. The Omega without documents was brought in neither first nor last. By then, the staff were already stretched to their limit. Free beds were being counted almost out loud. His stretcher came in surrounded by nurses talking fast and a little too loud, the way people talk when they are afraid to miss something important. Young Omega, no passport, no ID bracelet, no wallet. The car they pulled him from was crushed so badly that only the rescue team could tell front from back, a torn wound on his forehead, blood mixed with rainwater and dried into a crust, his hair, darkened from the moisture, sticking to his temples, marks from the seatbelt across his neck. His eyes were closed, lashes clumped together. His breathing was heavy and shallow, with harsh sounds no one liked. The ER doctor rattled off the basics: loss of consciousness at the scene, possible traumatic brain injury, suspected internal bleeding, blood pressure unstable, pulse erratic. The paramedics had already given the standard set of meds, fluids, painkillers, oxygen. It was not enough. In that moment, Elias did not think about the club, about the night, or about the Omega whose hands had trembled around a glass. He wasn't thinking about anyone as an individual, only about a bundle of symptoms that had to be shut down before it was too late. He leaned in, checked the pupils, tested pain response, noted the asymmetry. He ordered an urgent CT scan while giving instructions to stabilize blood pressure. His voice was flat, almost cold. Inside, everything was sliding into that special mode where the doctor's personality dissolves into pure function. As soon as the scanner is free, he goes to the OR, he said briefly. No one argued. The CT showed what he had expected to see: swelling, local bleeding, compression of structures that might still be saved. The decision came instantly. He signed the consent for emergency neurosurgery and went to the OR himself, not bothering to smooth the exhaustion off his face. The operation was long and sticky, like a bad dream. Under his gloves, He felt fragile bone. Under the lights, swollen tissue that should never have seen open air. It was like walking a tightrope. Remove everything extra without touching what kept this life going. Lower the pressure without collapsing the whole system. The monitors watched them, throwing out numbers that changed too sharply. Whether they were mocking or helping, who knew? At one point, when he leaned back for a second to catch his breath, a faint, familiar scent broke through the usual smell of blood and cautery. Something warm. Recognizable, like a perfume that used to be someone's favorite and then was discontinued. It lasted for a fraction of a second, easy to blame on heat and fatigue. Not now. He cut himself off and went back to work. When he finally got the pressure under control, stopped the bleeding and freed the brain from the worst compression, time in the OR was no longer measured in hours. It was measured in how many times they had changed the filters and tubing, and by the deep, dull ache in his own back. Elias sensed his hands working almost on autopilot while his head begged him to stop. The patient was transferred to ICU under deep sedation and a ventilator. Monitors were set up around the bed like a silent ring of guards. Pulse, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, intracranial pressure. Each line on each screen was its own melody, and he read them better than any sheet music. Only when the surge of adrenaline started to fade did Elias let himself stop at the bedside. The Omega lay motionless. His face was partly hidden under bandages. His lips were slightly parted. Under the lamps, his skin looked almost transparent. There were still marks from the seatbelt on his neck and fresh bruises on his arm where the IVs had gone in. His entire personal story now fit into a few lines in his chart. Unidentified Omega.age, mid-20s approximately. No documents, no emergency contacts, found in a car with no plates, presumably stolen. A short description of his clothes, his height, his approximate weight. No name, no address, no number to call and say, he's alive for now. Elias checked the monitor out of habit, touched the edge of the mask over the patient's face, made sure the ventilator tube was secure. And again, for the second time that day, he caught that odd, painfully familiar scent, faint, almost hidden under antiseptic and medication, but still breaking through, like an echo from another night in another place. He stood there just a few seconds, feeling his mind try to drag up some memory linked to that note. Silver shine, muffled bass, someone's shaking fingers on glass, something clenched inside him. Tired, he decided, forcing himself to look away. You're seeing things that aren't there. In his world, there was no place for coincidence, only statistics, probability, diagnosis. The Omega from the highway was for now just another case on the line between life and death. Everything else could wait, for later, for never. In the chart, his even handwriting added a neat note, condition critical but stable, post-operative period, prognosis guarded. The name field still said the same dry thing. Unidentified Omega. Outside the room, the hospital life kept buzzing along the corridors, new calls, new complaints, new stories, each demanding its own slice of his attention. Elias turned and walked on along his shift route, leaving behind a bed with a body that already tied him to itself much more than he was willing to admit. For now, only a shared smell of the night, which he stubbornly renamed fatigue. The first days after surgery blended together into a tight corridor of monitors and IV lines for the Omega. In the third room, that corridor hadn't even started. He lay in a deep, medically supported coma where time wasn't measured by shifts and rounds. The machine breathed for him. Pumps pushed fluids through his veins. Everything hummed the same dull song. Keep going. The room looked like dozens of others. White walls, plastic curtains, the little bedside table with a plastic folder on it. The chart inside was just a few printed pages with dry phrases and a blank line where a full name was supposed to be. In the name field, someone had neatly written unidentified Omega. Below that, a case number, a set of symbols standing where his name should have been. The ICU smell rarely changed. Disinfectant, clean sheets, plastic tubing. Human bodies turned into objects to keep alive. After a couple of hours, your nose stopped noticing nuances. But every time Elias walked into that room, he caught something else in the air. A warm, stubborn note from a completely different world, too faint to admit openly, too persistent to forget. By protocol, after such an operation, the primary physician had to check the patient several times a day. Elias came more often. He checked the pupil's reaction to light, even though he knew the sedation level made any response unlikely. He compared today's intracranial pressure with yesterday's. He watched the graphs a little too long. Sometimes, he simply stood there in silence, listening to the steady hiss of the ventilator. The nurses noticed his thoroughness the way you notice the weather. Just as a fact, Dr. Hale never let go of the heavy cases. If he held on to this omega a little tighter than to others, it was easy to explain with professional pride. Doesn't like to lose, the head nurse thought, adjusting the infusion pumps. It did not occur to her to look for anything beyond that. The longer the omega stayed unconscious, the clearer it became how alone he was. The identity search followed standard procedure. The hospital sent the data to the police. The police checked the accident reports, tried to match the wrecked car. A short line about a crash on the highway flashed in the news ticker. No details about the injured, no appeals for relatives to come forward. At the front desk, no one left flowers. No voice full of tears or anger broke out at the nurses' station. No one made scenes at the doors about their right to decide. The omega lay there like a paragraph torn out of a book, with the rest of the pages missing. His body carried traces of a past life, a thin scar on his collarbone, a healed piercing in his ear, a pale mark on his rib from some childhood fall or fight. All of that said, he had lived, he had fallen, gotten hurt, done something stupid, loved something, but inside these walls none of it mattered. Sometimes, when Elias stayed by the bed longer than usual, he caught himself wondering what this man's voice sounded like, low or high. Quiet or sharp, annoyed when interrupted, or stubbornly calm in an argument. Those thoughts came for a second, and he pushed them away. A doctor wasn't supposed to care about things that didn't affect prognosis. He kept repeating to himself, patient, multiple trauma, main goal is stabilize and minimize damage. But somewhere underneath that, another line kept whispering, person, no name, no one to even ask about him. The police sent an officer to the hospital. A young man in a wrinkled shirt looked into the room a couple of times, but didn't come close to the bed. He asked Elias about the condition, whether the patient would be able to give a statement anytime soon, wrote down a short no, and left. His voice held no pity and no curiosity, only the tiredness of someone for whom this was just another checkbox in a long list. Social services filled in their columns. If the man's identity wasn't established within a reasonable time, he would be reclassified as an anonymous patient with basic coverage. That meant fewer automatic procedures, more cost-effective decisions. On paper, it looked logical. In reality, it was a slow erasing of someone's story. Elias knew that too well. He had watched for years as patients without relatives disappeared from the ward quietly, almost without a trace. When they were discharged or died, the bed was cleared and someone else took their place. Charts went to the archive. Names, when there were names, sank into endless shelves. With this omega, something inside him resisted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a thick, stubborn no he did not say out loud even to himself. At night, the ICU sounded different, fewer footsteps, quieter voices. The monitors still beeped and clicked, but the background noise was less aggressive. One of those nights, after finishing his rounds, Elias stayed in the third room longer than he'd planned. The omega lay almost the same as on day one. His face was a little less swollen, his skin not as sickly gray. Under the bandages, the lines of his cheekbones were clearer now. Elias realized he was starting to recognize him by tiny details, by the shape of his nails, by the curve of his neck, by the way the skin on his forehead tightened when the pressure changed slightly. He checked the readings, rested his fingers for a second on the cold bed rail. He meant to leave, but for some reason stayed. Silence in the room was dense. Only the ventilator hissed in rhythm and the monitor clicked softly every time it recorded a new number. Elias leaned on the bed and, without moving his lips, began recapping the day in his head. The difficult heart case they had discussed at the consult, how a nurse mixed up the instrument trays and they had to redo the prep, how someone blocked the ambulance exit in the parking lot with a badly parked car. It wasn't a real story, just a stream of dry notes that helped him stuff the day into a straight line. The absurd thing was that he suddenly found himself sending these notes toward the unconscious man in front of him. "You almost died again today," flashed through his mind, and he surprised himself with how blunt that sounded. In the official records it looked much gentler. Short episode of hypotension, corrected with medication. But the truth was simple. This body, already hit by metal and torn open by a scalpel, had had to endure another shock. A short, sharp anger flared up inside him. He wasn't even sure at whom, the driver who lost control. At whoever put the Omega in that car, at the Omega himself, if he was the one who chose to drive that night, at the system that was already preparing to write him off because nobody showed up with a passport and a phone call. "Hold on," he breathed quietly, down at the floor. Even if he had said it out loud, the only answer would have been the same steady hiss of the ventilator. Nurses came into the room from time to time. They changed catheters, treated the skin, turned the body on schedule to prevent bed sores. They chatted about news, prices, family drama. For them, the Coma Omega from the crash was part of the job, an object of care. They did everything right, clean, and professional. There was no cruelty in their voices, but no special involvement either. Day 3 bled into 4 and 5. The numbers moved along their own paths, some looking a little better, some worrying. One of the blood tests showed an odd shift in the hormone panel. The lab tech noted it and carefully wrote in the comment field, "Possible artifact, recommend repeat test." Elias put that sheet aside in the check later stack, not linking it yet with any night or mask in his mind. To him, the patient was still the same, an unnamed body he was responsible for in front of protocols, colleagues, and his own conscience. And at the same time, less and less abstract. His scent, the line of his scar, the way his body stubbornly stayed alive through the ICU days, all of that was slowly punching through the protective layer of professional detachment. The patient without a biography was still nobody to the system. But for Elias, he was already starting to be more than a case number. On the third day after the accident, the morning began like all the others. Shift change, a short meeting, tired jokes at the nurse's station, the smell of freshly printed protocols. A thick stack of lab reports landed on Elias's desk, together with the usual summaries, electrolytes, inflammatory markers, hormone panels for omegas. He grabbed the first chart without thinking, sipped lukewarm coffee, and began scanning the lines, skipping over anything that didn't jump out. For the patient in the third room, most values were as expected. Stress, blood loss, heavy medication, nothing that couldn't be explained by trauma. He was about to set the sheet aside when his eyes caught a line highlighted by the lab tech. The repeat test confirmed a high level of a specific hormone, too high to write off as a glitch. Pregnant, the word shot up from his professional memory like a flare. Elias read the numbers again, as if a mistake might be hiding there, the concentration, the trend, the other related markers. Everything lined up into a clear picture of an early pregnancy, not a fantasy, not an artifact. A fact. For a second, his hand froze. The office was quiet. Somewhere outside, the phone rang at the nurse's station, and someone pushed a trolley down the hall. The usual hospital noise seemed to fall away to a distant murmur. One thought landed sharp as a blade. He is pregnant. The Omega in the third room lay unconscious, attached to machines, in a state where others made every decision for him. And inside that still pale body, another life was already unfolding. Tiny, barely started, and all the more fragile for it. A life he probably hadn't even known about before the metal and glass hit. Elias pushed the other results aside, hit the call button, and asked for a consult meeting. His voice sounded calm and businesslike, but inside everything had shifted. The treatment plan that had seemed solid yesterday scattered. Every drug, every infusion, every possible procedure now needed to be rechecked. Anything too aggressive might end the story not only for the patient, but also for the one hidden in the shadows of his charts. They gathered in a small conference room. An obstetrician, an anesthesiologist, a neonatologist, another intensivist. They laid the chart, the lab sheets, and the scans on the table. The discussion began in a dry, almost textbook way. Judging by the numbers, the term was very early. Only a few weeks, The trauma was serious but not catastrophic for the pelvis. There were no clear signs of massive bleeding in that area. The pregnancy was at risk, but not doomed by definition. They listed the risks calmly, like items on a checklist. The chance of a missed pregnancy. Possible later complications. The effect of hypoxia. Someone carefully voiced the thought that in some cases like this, teams focus on saving the mother. Elias felt a sharp physical protest rise in his chest and surprised himself with its strength. "We don't have the right to decide for him in advance," sounded in his head, and a second later he heard himself say almost the same words aloud. On paper, the consult reached a compromise. They would act as gently as possible, adjust therapy with the pregnancy in mind, monitor the fetus as the patient stabilized. No one could promise an outcome, but no one insisted on a hard either-or either. The official note was precise. Recommended to preserve the pregnancy in the absence of direct threats to the patient's life. Off the record, the picture was different. With no family, no legal representative, no voice to say, "I want this," or "I don't want this." The weight of the decision slid onto one person, the same man who had been signing the orders since the ambulance bay. Elias walked back to ICU with the chart in his hands, feeling like it was made of lead. The room met him with its familiar sounds. The hiss of the ventilator, the measured beep of the monitor, the soft rustle of oxygen through the tubing. The Omega lay as he had in the morning, eyes closed, head wrapped in bandages above the brows. Only now, for Elias, he was no longer just a body his license bound him to. He was also someone's possible future. He set the chart on the bedside table and looked down at the flat sheet over the man's abdomen. At that term, there was nothing to see from the outside, no curve, no obvious sign, only the knowledge that under skin and muscle, a quiet, delicate work was already underway. "Stubborn little thing," flashed through his mind, an almost tender thought he instantly pushed away. Not the time, not the place. The logical arguments tried to pull him back into his usual field. There are pregnant Omegas after trauma. There are difficult cases. This is not the first, not the last. There are protocols. There's literature. There are percentages, but over all those numbers press something else, not statistics. The feeling of personal involvement he had been fighting from the very second this patient arrived. The longer he stood by the bed, the more insistently other images pushed into his mind. The dim club lights, the silver mask, sweat shining at the throat, the smell of skin that had felt strangely clean against the thick smog of alcohol and pheromones. Short, tearing flashes of memory he tried to jerk away from, like from a camera, flash too bright for tired eyes. He almost heard, inside his own memory, that trembling from the night in the club, that moment when the body under him stopped playing and became real with all its fear and need. And that second later, at home, under the shower, when he was washing the club smell off his skin and thinking, "This can't happen again." Coincidences in a big city were inevitable. There were plenty of Omegas with similar scents, masks, anonymity, false associations. He repeated all of that to himself like a mantra. But every time he walked back into the third room, he caught in the air that same familiar, tormenting note, not an exact copy, not one-to-one, an echo. He had no right to build any kind of diagnosis on club memories, no right to even let the thought in that the child whose markers now glowed in the test results might have anything directly to do with him. That would break every boundary, every ethical rule he stubbornly believed in. And yet his subconscious had already stepped forward, while his conscious mind tried to retreat. Every time he drew up another medication in a syringe, he checked again whether it might harm the pregnancy, as if he were answering not only to a future, abstract patient, but to someone painfully personal. Every time he signed a sheet with changes in the therapy, he felt the pen grow heavier for a split second in his fingers. "If this is my fault, then I owe them." The phrase flashed so clearly that he cut it off halfway inside his head. Fault. Oh, dangerous words for a doctor who was supposed to think in probabilities, not moral debts. But the fact remained. He was now responsible not for one person, for two. And as long as neither of them had a voice that could say, "Stop," his own oath was the only sound that could defend them. With each day, the story grew heavier, not in numbers, but in the weight of decisions. On the monitor, the Omega's vitals were leveling out. His heart held a rhythm. Blood pressure stopped dropping into dangerous pits. His breathing settled into acceptable parameters on the ventilator. The brain swelling slowly, but still, went down. The EEG showed faint but encouraging bursts of activity. Fingers sometimes twitched, as if the body was trying to feel its way back. Somewhere deep inside, where no scanner or sensor could reach, life was also doing its work. Repeat tests confirmed it. The pregnancy had not ended. The markers climbed just the way they were supposed to. The child who had survived metal anesthesia and shock seemed to cling stubbornly to their tiny chance. Against this background of slow medical improvement, another threat appeared, completely different in nature. The clinic's administration, looking not at the Omega but at their funding tables, saw more than diagnoses in his chart. They saw empty spaces where there were usually insurance details, family contacts, payment guarantees. Their internal rules were simple and ruthless. No-name patients were not kept long on expensive ICU beds. At one of the morning meetings, the chief administrator, eyes still on his tablet, calmly announced that the papers to transfer this social case to a public hospital were already being prepared. The wording was neat: resource optimization, load distribution, maintaining the clinic's profile as a high-tech center. Behind those phrases, it was easy to read what no one liked to say out loud: he was too expensive to keep. Elias listened and felt a heavy, sticky wave of protest rise in his chest. The transfer would not just be a change of walls and logo. In the overcrowded city hospital, they were short of staff, equipment, and time. No one there was going to fine-tune doses around a developing fetus. No one would call for a midnight consult because of one nameless Omega. They would fight for survival at the minimum level. The unborn child, barely a footnote on paper, would simply disappear from sight. He understood the other side, too. The clinic was not a charity. ICU beds were needed by many. Any administrator would say, "We can't save everyone." Behind that rational idea stood something he personally could not accept: abandoning a patient he himself had dragged out of the OR when it felt like one more misstep and everything would collapse. The internal conflict was almost physical. Inside him, two men clashed: the doctor, raised on protocols and systems thinking, and the man who felt more and more personally involved in the fate of this body and the one growing inside it. The part of him that always said a doctor must not get attached had already lost. The decision came without a grand phrase, more like a point he had been slowly approaching these days. At some moment, it simply became clear that he could not allow the transfer to be decided without his interference, even if it meant stepping beyond his usual professional distance. He asked for a meeting with the management himself. The chief physician's office was bright. It smelled of polished wood and coffee that always sat on the table and cooled to the bottom of the cup. Formally, the conversation was about bed load and statistics. Informally, about whether he was ready to put his own name on the line. Elias spoke calmly, without emotional flair. He laid out the medical arguments: a rare case of severe trauma combined with early pregnancy, scientific interest, the need for close observation in a high-tech center. But at some point, he had to say the main thing, briefly, almost dryly. He was willing to take the patient under his personal responsibility. He was ready to cover part of the treatment costs, ready to involve a charity fund he had worked with for complex rehab cases, ready to supervise a transfer not into an overloaded city hospital, but into a specialized facility where he had colleagues he trusted. On paper, all of that could be packaged as yet another sponsored project. The forms would say, paid from off-budget sources, clinic curator, doctor. Hail! Inside, it was a step he had never taken before, an admission that one particular patient mattered more to him than a statistical unit. The chief physician looked at him with that special attention that appears when a good specialist suddenly starts behaving too personally. In his eyes, Elias read both respect and wariness. Initiatives like this always carried risk: rumors, gossip, accusations of favoritism, but Elias's reputation was spotless, and his name and connections brought the clinic too much benefit to brush him off. In the end, the decision was in his favor. The Omega would stay. The transfer to a public hospital was postponed. A long, bureaucratically heavy process of assigning him a special status began. In the department, people reacted in different ways. The head nurse just shrugged. She had seen him pull someone out on principle before. The young residents exchanged looks, some with admiration, some with mild jealousy. Someone whispered in the hallway that Dr. Hale clearly owes that Omega something. Gossip grew like mold in a damp corner, but didn't make it past the staff rooms. Elias forced himself to ignore the whispers. He came back to the Omega's bedside, now not only as a doctor on duty, but as a man who had officially signed under the phrase personal responsibility. Under that dry term hid too much for him to breathe easy. On the rare evenings he made it home, the apartment met him with emptiness, clean surfaces, straight lines of furniture, shelves of books sorted by topic, one cup on the table, a space perfectly suited for a man who spent most of his life at the hospital. No forgotten items, no signs of a second person, no soft footsteps in another room. Against that background, the thought that somewhere, in a white room, an Omega with a child lay under his control sounded especially loud. Too loud for someone who always believed his world should be split into clear zones: work and personal, blood and numbers, responsibility and distance. He caught himself staring at the empty half of the bed, the free chair at the kitchen table, the closed window where city lights flickered outside. And every time his mind circled back, not to reports and statistics, but to the way the nameless patient's fingers twitched whenever he straightened the blanket. "I took you on," he would say silently during another shift at his bedside. A simple, dangerous phrase. From that moment on, any outcome, good or tragic, could no longer remain just a line in the mortality rate column of a report. Despite all efforts, the clinic's resources stayed finite, and so did the system's patients. The neuro-ICU team more and more often said the same thing at consults. For further recovery, the Omega needed not only equipment, but quiet. Fewer harsh sounds, fewer staff changes, fewer strangers walking past his bed, less risk of hospital infections. Less constant stress from an environment where even a coma did not mean real rest. The rehab center Elias had worked with for years was ideal for patients after severe brain injury. They knew how to pull people back from nowhere, slowly and carefully, but the center was not set up for managing a pregnancy. No 24/7 obstetric team, minimal equipment for fetal monitoring, no standard perinatal protocols. It was the classic dilemma where any line in the chart looked like a compromise. Keep the Omega in the overloaded ICU where every extra day meant higher infection risk, or send him somewhere quiet and lose full prenatal care for him and the baby. The idea that in other circumstances would have seemed insane didn't arrive as a sudden jolt. It had been circling the edge of his mind for days before finally rising to its full height. Elias could give the patient what none of the standard options could: a home that would turn into a temporary ward. He had a spacious apartment on the top floor, designed more for a family he never had, a spare room he had used for years as a storage space for books and extra furniture, enough room to put in a hospital bed, a monitor, pumps, oxygen support equipment. He had a small team, a nurse who worked with him on private cases, and several people from a mobile service ready to join the home care plan. And there was himself, an intensivist used to living on the narrow line between too early and too late. On paper, it could all fit into the concept of home care under direct supervision of a doctor, not as a reckless stunt, but as a bridge between ICU and rehab. In reality, it meant one thing: he was about to let the hospital into his personal space, wiping the border between work and home almost to nothing. Legally, the path was not simple. In the documents, the Omega was still listed as an unidentified person. Transferring him to a private residence was only possible through a court order by granting temporary guardianship and declaring Elias the responsible party. The petition contained the usual phrases: in the patient's best interest, ensuring continuity of care, availability of appropriate conditions. Behind the dry wording stood a much simpler truth. He was not ready to hand this man back to a system that had already tried once to push him out. The court reviewed the doctor's statements and clinic records and gave its approval. In the Guardian field appeared the name Dr. Hale. From that moment on, he was responsible not just professionally, but officially, for the Omega who could neither sign nor object. The process of turning the apartment into a ward started with rearranging furniture that felt more like surgery than cleaning. The guest room was cleared of extras. Heavy curtains were taken down. The second rug was removed to cut down on dust. In place of the bed, they set up a functional hospital frame with adjustable sections. An IV pole went by the wall. Next to it, a monitor, power blocks, containers for supplies. A portable oxygen concentrator appeared, an emergency ventilation kit, a case with medications that normally lived in a treatment room. The living room, where a neat table and a shelf of medical journals used to stand, turned into an improvised nurse's station. A folder with charts lay on the side of the table, with a tablet for his electronic records next to it. A small fridge for medications took its place in the corner. The kitchen filled up with extra containers for sterile materials and fluids. Even the sound of the household fridge started to feel like part of the background noise of a mini ICU. On the day of the transfer, Elias rode in the ambulance not as the doctor in charge, but as the escorting guardian. The Omega lay strapped on the stretcher, with nasal cannulas instead of a big tube, with sensors stuck to his fingers and chest. His face was still very pale, with the thin scar on his forehead and the yellowish tinge of skin after weeks under ICU lamps. His eyes remained closed. The vehicle bounced gently over seams in the asphalt. The equipment jingled softly, adapting to the motion. As they carried the stretcher up the stairs and pushed it through the narrow doorway of the apartment, Elias felt the absurdity of it all almost physically. The place that had been his safe zone, where he hid from other people's pain, was now literally bringing that pain in, with metal frames, wires, and a faint but stubborn heartbeat. The house filled with new sounds in a single day. Nighttime silence was gone. In its place came the regular beeps of the monitor, the soft whisper of air in the cannulas, rare, half-conscious sighs from the patient. In the kitchen, the faucet turned on far more often. Hands now had to be washed dozens of times a day. The nurse walked down the hallway with that firm, familiar step that made the floor creak almost inaudibly. Every few hours, the intercom rang with another delivery of supplies. Elias split his life into micro-shifts. Morning, rounds at the clinic, surgeries, consults. Day, home, checking vitals, changing dressings, passive limb movements to keep muscles from wasting. Evening, back to the hospital or remote consults. Then night, a night where every few hours he got up to check the monitor and make sure the rhythm had not slipped, the pressure had not dropped, the breathing was still stable. The nurse who had long worked with him on complex cases took the new setup as a fact. She came 2 or 3 times a day, did her procedures, sometimes stayed a little longer when she saw how tired he was, but even with her, most of the care fell on him. In a normal hospital, those duties would be shared by a whole team. Here, everything closed inside one apartment and one choice. A home used to sterile order, slowly filled with small chaotic signs of the new routine. A white coat was constantly hanging over the chair in the living room. A clock stood on the windowsill near the bed, turned toward the doctor rather than the patient. Boxes of gloves and a stethoscope he no longer put away lay on the hallway table. Even the light changed. Night lamps that used to be for occasional reading now burned almost constantly, giving soft but enough light to see the Omega's face at any moment. The smell changed too. Antiseptics and medications entered the air, but over them came another layer, warm, barely noticeable, the same one he had smelled under hospital scents. Here, at home, it was clearer. The Omega lay on white sheets, and despite the pallor, his skin looked more alive. Between the faint pulse at his neck and the shallow line of his breaths, another life kept growing somewhere deep inside, unseen but constantly present. That sense of another presence made the apartment not just a ward, but something like an incubator. For the child, this place became the first home where they grew, without knowing it. For Elias, it was a constant reminder of that night he had never truly managed to shut out. Any sound in that room, from the monitor beep to the soft rustle when the body was turned, inevitably linked back in his mind to that short club episode when he had allowed himself to be, not a doctor, just a man in a mask. Now there were no masks left. The home that for years had been his refuge had turned into a place where two lives depended on his decisions and on whether he could withstand this new kind of closeness. Time inside the apartment stopped being a straight line. The calendar in the kitchen still showed dates, but Elias's real measurement changed, not numbers. Tiny shifts in the omega's condition. The day the pupils reacted to light just a little more clearly. The night the EEG showed a barely noticeable burst of activity. The morning when the fingers on the right hand moved, not as a random spasm, but as an attempt at movement. He learned to catch those signals as precisely as he had once caught tiny color changes in tissue during surgery. There were no more normal days. There were 24 hours in which once the blood pressure held steady on its own, or once the pulse evened out without extra drugs. Little victories only he and the nurse noticed, little setbacks that turned the night into a long, endless vigil beside the monitor. A new morning ritual formed on its own. First, a quick shower to wash away the hospital smell of the previous shift. Then, coffee, which he no longer drank on the run, but standing in the doorway of the guest room, holding the mug in both hands and counting the patient's breaths. After that, checking lines and tubes, fasteners, the skin under the sensors. He moved almost silently, but each time he came up to the bed, the monitors seemed to react. The pulse ticked up slightly. The breathing rhythm deepened. At first, he tried to keep the same hard, professional distance in the room that he used at the hospital. But home silence worked differently than ICU silence. There, beyond the wall, someone was always moaning, calling, running down the corridor. Here, between four walls, his voice was the only living sound besides the machines. At some point, he could no longer tolerate that emptiness. At first, it was short, almost clinical phrases, thrown out on his way past, like in the ward. Pressure is normal. Today's better. You're holding on. Then, the words stretched into sentences on their own. He caught himself commenting on the weather, the color of the sky outside, remembering how much he used to hate early morning surgeries in med school. He told stories about pointless arguments in the work chat, about how a young intern almost injected contrast instead of saline. He retold other people's stories, without names or details, simply to fill the space. He spoke calmly, without expecting an answer, but deep down there remained a naive hope. If the doctor's voice kept sounding nearby, the world had not fully erased this man yet. Sometimes the words slid toward dangerous territory. The club, the heavy bass, the light breaking over masks, the silver silhouette, the scent that still tightened his throat. He caught himself a few times describing that music out loud, pretending it was someone else's story. Each time he cut himself off, as if afraid that under closed eyelids the patient might somehow recognize the rhythm, the tone, and the invisible link would become too obvious. Meanwhile, another, more tangible life kept growing. The specialists he brought home set up a portable ultrasound machine right in the living room. For the duration of the exam, the room that usually smelled of books filled with the hum of equipment and the crackle of gloves. They carefully turned the omega, pulled the blanket away from his abdomen, spread cold gel on his skin. When the tiny, trembling heart appeared on the screen, beating with surprising persistence, Elias felt something tighten inside every single time. The black and white outline promised very little yet, a small head. Buds of limbs, fragile, unstable, but there was no denying reality anymore. Here, under his roof, under his control, a person was growing. The specialists spoke in their usual dry professional language. Term this, development appropriate, no visible anomalies. Continue monitoring. To them it was a set of indicators, to him, another chain. One more point where his responsibility was anchored, and a new source of strange, frightening warmth he did not dare examine too closely. At night, the line between past and present blurred. Sometimes he dreamed of the club, the same smell of sweat and alcohol, the same heavy, sticky light, only now, instead of dance floors and VIP booths, a hospital bed stood in the middle of the dream. The omega in the silver mask lay on it with his eyes closed, and above him shone not neon tubes but operating lamps. In the dream, Elias reached out to adjust the mask, and his fingers suddenly found the familiar scar on the forehead and the pulse oximeter sensor. The music shifted, turning into the measured beep, beep, beep of the monitor. He woke up with the sense that he had left something critically important undone. Sometimes he got up and went to the room, looked at the screen, smooth lines, stable numbers, at the Omega's face, still calm, distant, at the abdomen, almost unchanged, but already the center of another orbit, and every time he thought the same thing. If this really is my child, I will find out too late. He drove those thoughts away like a dangerous diagnosis you were not allowed to make without tests. He had no right to draw conclusions based on a scent, a dream, and a single memory. But the subconscious built its own links without permission. Every recorded heartbeat on the ultrasound sounded to him like a possible echo of his own mistake. Outside, the world almost did not change. At the clinic, duty rosters still marched across the board. Staff meetings still happened. New patients still came in. His colleagues knew he had taken a complicated case into his home. Some respected him for it. Some looked on with mild skepticism, thinking Dr. Hale was once again pushing responsibility too far. They whispered behind his back. But it was the usual whisper, not the poison he heard in the news when another medical scandal hit, more like cautious curiosity. None of them knew about the night in the club. None of them imagined which Omega he was changing dressings for and monitoring at home. None of them could guess that every time he pressed the stethoscope to the Omega's abdomen to listen to the baby's heart, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe I am listening not only to a patient's life, but to my own blood too. Sometimes, coming home from a late shift, he paused in the hallway without taking off his shoes, just stood there and listened. From the cracked open guest room came the familiar background, the quiet hiss of oxygen, soft clicks from the devices, the occasional beep. These sounds had become his beacon. As long as they were there was still something he could fix, push, pull back. As long as he heard them, the world had not slipped into that absolute silence death always began with. His steps between that silence and life became his only route. He walked the corridor from his bedroom to the guest room dozens of times a night, sometimes just to make sure the equipment was running, sometimes to adjust the blanket, his fingers sliding over the cold fabric, sometimes to sit on the edge of the bed and almost in a whisper, say that it had rained outside, that they finally discharged the old woman with pneumonia, that today on ultrasound the tiny heart was beating a little stronger. "Do you hear me?" slipped out once, so quietly he barely heard it himself. There was no answer, only the same familiar rhythm, that machine music he had almost learned to live with. But something inside shifted. He caught himself no longer thinking the patient when he thought of this Omega. Somewhere between his night walks and daytime procedures, the faceless case had become part of his own lifeline. He was still a doctor, still logged vitals, still checked in with specialists, still adjusted treatment regimens. But between the lines of those notes, something else surfaced, something no form or protocol could hold. A personal, heavy, almost unbearable attachment to a man who had not yet opened his eyes, and to a child he saw only in the grainy light of the ultrasound. The breakthrough came on one of those evenings when his body was running purely on inertia. Elias had finished a brutal surgery, left the hospital in the dark, and stood for a minute by his car, trying to shake off the feel of someone else's blood and tension that would not wash away with water or antiseptic. The road home blurred in a half-sleep. He thought only of a shower and coffee, strong enough to keep him on the surface for a few more hours. When he opened the apartment door, the home met him with its now familiar quiet. It was no longer the emptiness of a bachelor's place. Under that silence, another, new life hummed steadily. He paused in the hallway, still in his shoes, listening. From the half-open door came the usual sounds, the soft hiss of oxygen, the faint clicks of devices, the monitor's regular chirp. Only today that background sounded different. The pulse monitor was counting faster than usual. The ventilator-guided breaths were slightly deeper and more regular. On the screen, where the brain activity line had hovered for weeks on the edge between 0 and weak static, a more confident, uneven, but clearly defined wave now ran. On the outside, the Omega still lay completely still, but his face had changed. Where total relaxation had been, There was now a slight tension around the mouth. His eyelids trembled with a barely noticeable rhythm, as if someone underneath was trying to move toward the light. Elias checked the parameters automatically, straightened the mask on the patient's face, checked the attachments. Everything was within acceptable limits. Nothing called for emergency action, and yet the internal gauge he could not quantify registered one thing. Something had shifted. In the next days, that invisible border kept moving. Where there had been only reflexes, first awkward attempts at movement appeared. The arm that had just lain there suddenly jerked, as if trying to grab the air. His neck tensed, his head lifted a fraction and fell back. A first sound tore out of his throat, hoarse, meaningless, but human, not a groan of pain, more like a protest from a body pulled back into reality. Consultants coming to the apartment noted the changes in their reports. They spoke cautiously, the way they always did in such cases. Probable emergence from coma, gradual return of consciousness. We must wait, watch, avoid rushing. In their voices was their usual guarded optimism, diluted by professional skepticism. To them, this was one more difficult recovery story. To Elias, an approaching unavoidable meeting with a man he had known for weeks only as a body, numbers, and silence. Alongside this outward awakening, details of that night he had smeared over with blurry strokes began to wake inside him. He had remembered the club as one big, noisy mass of light and sound. Now, memory yanked separate fragments out of that mass. The Omega's neckline, exposed by the collar and mask, almost transparent skin over his collarbones, the movement of his hand when he pushed another drink away, not wanting more alcohol, the light, barely noticeable tremor running through his torso when Elias first touched his wrist. The scent, too, returned. Oddly enough, not from the ICU, but from that club half dark. Back then, it had drowned in the mix of alcohol, perfume, smoke, and sweat. Now that the hospital smells had scrubbed most of that from his memory, only the core remained. That same warm, slightly spicy note he now recognized instantly whenever he entered the room. The clearer these matches became, the harder it was to keep telling himself it was just his imagination. One weekend, sorting through drawers in his closet, he came across something he had almost forgotten about. A small, hard object had rolled into a corner, and his fingers brushed it by accident. Cold plastic with smooth edges. The silver club mask. He pulled it out into the light like evidence. In his hands it felt lighter than that night, no longer warmed by someone else's skin, no longer trembling with shared breath, just a mask. One of dozens of accessories for people who went to places like that. But the moment he pressed it against his palm, his body answered with memory. He saw the same shape settle on the Omega's face, hiding his eyes and leaving his mouth open. Remembered how his lashes had trembled under it, how he had held the mask with one hand and his back with the other, to keep him from losing his balance. Coincidence, any rational person would say. Standing in his perfectly organized bedroom, holding the mask, he finally put words to what had been circling the edge of his mind for so long. The chance that the Omega in his guest room was the same man from the club was rapidly leaving the theoretical zone. The pregnancy dates the specialists gave him lined up too precisely with that night. The matching scent, the familiar lines of his body, the way his body reacted to Elias's voice. Any one of those could be dismissed as the nervous system playing tricks. Together, they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. The thought felt filthy and strangely calm at the same time. Black humor of fate laid out neatly on the shelf. A doctor who had built his career on distance had allowed himself one anonymous weakness under pounding music. Then, in another role, had saved the same man from death, not knowing who he was cutting out of mangled metal. Now he was living under the same roof, with a body that was most likely carrying his child, and getting ready to meet the eyes of someone whose name he had not even asked that night. He knew it was still far from proven. There were no tests, no confessions, no clear trail of paperwork, only guesses, sense, timelines that lined up a little too well, but inside, something was already shifting. What had been an abstract personal responsibility for a patient and a fetus was gradually turning into something else, a much more concrete sense of guilt. The Omega's condition kept changing. Reflexes grew stronger. His body was taking over more of the breathing, and the ventilator only had to support, not do everything. Sometimes during checkups, Elias felt weak kicks under his palm, cautious, uncertain jabs from tiny feet inside. Before, he took them as a clinical sign that the baby was still developing. Now, every kick sounded like a silent question. Who am I to you, besides a body you're monitoring? The apartment lived right on the border of two realities. In one, there was still a nameless patient, a clinical case, difficult but understandable in professional terms. In the other, the figure of the Omega from the club was slowly coming into focus, and next to him, not just a fetus, but possibly his own child. Between these two realities, flashes blinked on and off, scraps of memories, guesses, scents, movements under the skin, and the closer came the moment when the Omega would finally open his eyes, the clearer Elias could feel it. With that first look, truth would walk into the room too. The truth he had so far had the luxury of treating as just a possibility. The day the Omega first opened his eyes in the apartment looked completely ordinary from the outside. Gray rain behind the windows, the monitor in the corner ticking out heartbeats, a clock in the hallway marking off the seconds. Elias stepped into the room between two phone calls from the clinic, planning to do a quick check of the vitals, straighten the pillow, jot down a few numbers in the chart. He came up to the bed and let his gaze slide over the patient's face like he had done 100 times. Only then did he realize something was off. The eyelids were lifted, not all the way, not steadily, but enough that the dark pupils beneath reacted to the light. They narrowed, tried to focus, slipped to the side, and came back to the blurry shape standing at the head of the bed. The hand resting on the sheet jerked, as if trying to rise. Fingers scraped weakly over the fabric, barely managing to crumple it. The body that had been a dead weight for so long was finally reminding them there was still will living inside it. Consciousness returned unevenly. The first hours and days felt like swimming through thick fog. The Omega, now with a name finally pulled from a broken database, though still a stranger to himself, Leo, caught random fragments of reality, light and shadow, a warm voice saying calm phrases, other people's hands carefully rolling him onto his side, the rustle of sheets, the smell of medicine, muscle pain when he tried to move. Sometimes he slipped back into darkness, but it was no longer the deep void of coma, more like a heavy sleep he could, in theory, surface from. And every time he rose closer to that surface, the same things were waiting there. A white ceiling, the rectangle of a window, and that same voice, explaining where he was, what had happened, and that everything was under control. At first, the meaning didn't really stick. The words broke apart into separate sounds, but the emotional tone reached him sooner than the logic. The voice was steady. No irritation. No panic, not overly soft. It didn't sound fake, but not cold either. That steady tone was the first thing Leo clung to so he wouldn't fall back under. When the confusion eased just a little, fragments of his old life started to return. At first they were small, everyday pictures. The gray stairwell in his building, his phone screen blinking with notifications, a mug with a cracked handle in his kitchen. Then came faces, a colleague laughing at something in the office hallway, the barista at the small cafe by the station, the person behind the wheel in that last night before the impact. But whole stretches remained black holes. Between the familiar routine and the blinding flash of headlights aimed straight at his windshield, there was a blank space. Something was supposed to be there, but his memory stubbornly refused to bring it up. A club with neon signs, music, masks, anonymous warmth in someone else's hands. All of it still lay too deep down. Elias did exactly what he'd been trained to do. He didn't push. He didn't bombard the patient with questions or try to drag memories out by force. He explained step by step. Leo had been in a car crash, had surgery, spent a long time unconscious. Right now he was under temporary guardianship, in a safe place where he was being monitored. Each explanation cost Elias more than a usual talk with a patient's family, because behind the dry facts stood things he had no right to mention yet. Leo listened, frowned from fatigue, fell asleep mid-sentence. His body felt wrong. His arms were weaker than he remembered. His legs refused to obey. His head ached dully when he turned it. And then there was his stomach. Not flat like before, but heavy, full, living its own life. If he tried to shift his position, a faint movement answered from inside, as if someone gently pushed the wall from within. At first, he blamed it on the trauma, on the meds, on strange sensations after so long without moving. But when one day a woman walked into the room with a small machine, put a cold probe on his skin, and a pulsing shape appeared on the screen, it became impossible to ignore. The doctor spoke calmly, without dramatic pauses, as if this was just part of protocol. He explained that the pregnancy had been discovered after the accident, at a very early stage, that the stress had been huge, but the baby was still developing, that now the task was to restore Leo's health and, at the same time, give the pregnancy the safest conditions possible. The words still didn't form a full picture, but the sound of the small heart, beating confidently on the screen, cut through any confusion. It was too fast, too clear to be his own. Leo listened to that rhythm, and for a moment, the world narrowed down to one thought. Somewhere inside this weak, bandaged body, someone else was already living, someone he didn't remember, someone he never planned, someone whose origin he couldn't name. The panic didn't hit him all at once. It came in waves. First, surprise, almost detached. Then, an attempt to find logic. Somewhere in that blanked-out zone, there had to be the person this started with, an alpha whose face refused to appear, no matter how he tried to drag it up from the dark. Between his old life and this new reality, there was a night, and from it only scraps remained, the sharp smell of smoke, heavy bass in someone's hands on his waist. He tried to grab onto it, clung to separate sensations, light cutting into his eyes, a mask on his face, warm breath at his ear, a voice whispering very close to him. The words blurred, but the timbre stayed. Low, a little hoarse, both calming and dangerous at the same time. In one of those dreams, he woke up with his heart racing, his fingers digging into the sheet, and it took several long breaths to realize he wasn't in a club, not in a car. He was in a warm, quiet room. And at that exact second, he heard that familiar voice beside him. This time it wasn't whispering. It was talking in its usual working tone, explaining something about medications and dosages, and something in Leo's chest twisted. The voice matched, not perfectly, not like a cleaned-up recording, but enough for his subconscious to slam the alarm. His body reacted before his mind did. A caught breath, a sudden flush under his skin, that strange, almost painful feeling of recognition. Elias noticed that tiny reaction, the slight widening of the pupils, the tension in his shoulders, like in someone who's just heard a melody they know but can't place. He pretended not to notice. He asked how Leo was feeling, adjusted the pillow, checked the monitor. Then he walked out into the hallway and stopped there, leaning his palms against the wall. On the surface, rehab was moving by the book. Leo was learning to sit up without support again, hold a spoon, walk as far as the window. In every step, every clumsy movement, the same doctor was there, the one his entire new biography now leaned on. Between them, a bond had formed, visible even to an outside observer, a patient, and the man who had literally pulled him back from nowhere. His memory continued to throw up scraps like an old film someone kept winding forward and back. Leo saw not only the crash in the hospital ceiling in his dreams, but also club lights, moving shapes, a silver mask in the mirror. Sometimes he woke up with the clear feeling that this voice had already spoken in his life in a very different setting. That these hands, which now held him steady for his first steps, had once held him in a completely different way. He didn't say any of that out loud. There were too many gaps, too fragile were these guesses. For now they stayed inside, somewhere between his nighttime panic attacks and the daytime exhaustion after exercises. But every time the doctor leaned closer to fix a sensor or help him roll over, that scent and that timbre brought the same increasingly stubborn thought up from the deep. If there really had been a night out there, beyond his memory, that changed everything, then the man standing now at his bedside might not have been just his doctor in that story. Truth rarely falls on you like a hammer. Most of the time it seeps in like water into cracks in concrete, filling everything around until suddenly it becomes obvious. The old shape is gone. For Leo, this truth gathered drop by drop, from fragments of dreams, from smells, from someone's voice his brain kept trying to label as safe background. And then one small detail turned out to be the final stroke that tied all the lines together. It was an ordinary evening, as ordinary as evening could be in an apartment where one room had been turned into a mini ICU. Leo could already move around the place with a cane, making short loops from bed to window and back. His legs shook, his muscles ached, but every step proved that his body belonged to him again, not to tubes and machines. This time he pushed himself to reach the living room, no nurse walking next to him, no extra support, just because the bedroom walls were starting to press in. He walked slowly, counting his steps by feel, leaning on the cane and the now familiar map of sounds in the flat, the soft rush of the air conditioner, the low hum of the fridge, the distant city noise behind the glass. None of these sounds scared him anymore. The living room met him with a soft light and almost sterile order. Nothing extra. No random clutter. Bookshelves, a neat couch, a table covered in stacks of articles, and a tablet. Leo stopped by the shelf to catch his breath and let his gaze drift along the spines. Medical journals, monographs, a couple of harmless travel books, as if someone was trying to prove to themselves that life existed beyond hospitals. And exactly there, between two tall volumes, he saw it. The silver mask had been shoved away carelessly, like something someone wanted out of sight, but hadn't found a real place for. Its top edge stuck out just enough to catch a strip of light. The cold shine of the metallic plastic hit him harder than any smell. Leo didn't at first understand why his heart skipped a beat and then started pounding. His fingers tightened around the cane until his knuckles turned white. The mask wasn't unique. Clubs in this city sold dozens like it, but his body reacted before logic did. Heat rose in his chest, his stomach clenched, and not only because of the pregnancy. Images flared in his mind, hands on his waist, heavy bass, the floor vibrating under his feet, light slashing across narrow eye holes. He blinked, and for a second the living room fell apart like a set. In its place, a narrow clubroom appeared. Dark walls, shifting shadows, cold plastic on his face, the taste of alcohol on his tongue, his head spinning faintly from the cocktail of smells. Someone behind him, taller, broader, warm, steady, the one who had held him that night so that for a few hours there were no bills, no deadlines, no exhaustion. The one whose name he hadn't asked, the one to whom he hadn't given his own. The memory hit so sharply that Leo actually swayed. He leaned his shoulder against the shelves, feeling the tremor spread from his chest to his hands. For a moment the world narrowed down to a single point, that mask, that cold strip of metal that seemed to be smiling at him with a hollow grin. Footsteps sounded behind him, calm even, the steps he now knew as well as his own heartbeat. No hurry, no fuss, just the weight of a man used to night shifts and the soft sound of socks on the floor. Elias walked into the living room, planning to check how Leo was handling the extra load, and froze in the doorway. He didn't need to look at the shelf to understand what the Omega had seen. The direction of his gaze, the way he stood, the fist clenched around the cane. It was all obvious. The air between them changed in an instant. Silence stopped being comfortable. It grew sharp edges. They stood there for several long seconds, one by the shelf, the other by the door. Between them, the mask, like material proof that their story had a common root long before the accident, before the coma, before the white sheets. Leo broke the vacuum first. His voice cracked, betrayed him with a rasp, but the words came out clear enough. "It was here all this time," he said, without even trying to make it a question. The sentence hung in the air, heavy like a verdict. Elias felt that familiar mix rising inside him, fear and shame, the same things he'd spent years learning to suppress in the operating room. He could have lied, said the mask wasn't his, that some guest forgot it, that he'd just picked up a random object from a random place. But that path ended before it even fully formed in his mind. There had already been too many decisions between them that he'd made without hiding behind someone else. "Yes," he said at last, rough, without trying to soften it. That short answer, almost emotionless, became the missing piece Leo needed for the picture in his head to click into place. The night at the club, the silver mask on his face, someone's fingers carefully taking it off in the half-dark, a face he hadn't really seen, more felt than recognized, a voice whispering nothing words into his ear just to drown out the noise. And that same voice later, without the noise, in the OR, at home, by his bed. Elias stepped closer, slowly, like he'd approach a patient on the edge of an episode. He reached for the shelf, took the mask down and held it in his fingers for a moment. The cold plastic seemed to repel his skin. In his head, old teachers' warnings floated up about boundaries, about never mixing roles, about how a doctor had no right to anonymous nights that could lead to consequences like this. "That was our night," he said finally, choosing honesty. No excuses, no soft phrasing. Just a fact. Leo's knees nearly gave out, but the cane kept him from falling. A lump rose in his throat, and for a moment his thoughts turned into air he couldn't push out properly. Inside, everything tangled. Anger, fear, relief, disgust at his own memory, and gratitude that the empty spaces were finally filling in. He hadn't gone to the club that night as a victim. He had chosen this himself, to hide behind a mask, shut off his rational mind, allow himself one night where no one asked questions. But the consequences turned out to be far bigger than he could have imagined. He hadn't planned a pregnancy, hadn't planned a crash, hadn't planned to wake up in the home of the same alpha who had once held him under cover of anonymity. There was no anonymity left now. In Leo's eyes, Elias saw a whole spectrum of feelings. There was pain, not just physical, from the trauma, but the kind that comes when your own life story suddenly reshapes. There was resentment, that the truth had been hidden so long that the doctor he entrusted his body to was the same man he'd given his body to in a completely different way. And there was that strange, almost guilty relief. Because now the child inside him had an actual father's face, not just a faceless shadow. For Elias, the moment didn't bring relief. It felt more like a point where everything he'd tried to keep separate finally crashed together. The unfamiliar, sharp desire he'd felt in the club, the decision to drag Leo out of the wreck at any cost, the stubbornness with which he fought for every reaction in the ICU, the impulse to bring him home, even when it broke every protocol. He could no longer hide behind his title, behind the oath, behind the default line, "The doctor must." No job description explained why he sat by Leo's bed at night long after his shift ended, why his chest clenched every time the machines squealed unexpectedly, why this Omega's scent cut into his memory so deeply no antiseptic could scrub it out. The truth was under his skin, not on paper, in the way his body reacted to Leo's presence, in the way the baby kicked under his palm during exams, in how his voice softened every time he spoke, not just to a patient, but to a man he was bound to by more than a club and a case. A new pause settled between them, not awkward silence when you don't know what to say, more like dense space where they both understood. There was no going back. You couldn't unsee the mask any more than you could undo the words that had already been spoken. Leo looked away first, not because he was afraid, but because the storm inside was too strong and eye contact with its source was unbearable. He sat down in the nearest chair, feeling the wave of fatigue roll over him. The baby inside seemed to echo his state with a light kick. A reminder, from now on, any decision he made wasn't only about himself. Elias set the mask down on the table, not back on the shelf. It was no longer a private prop he could use to cover his own past. Now it was a symbol of blurred boundaries they'd both have to redraw. He sat across from Leo, leaving just enough space not to press, but also not to retreat. He really didn't have any excuses. He could have said that night he'd been exhausted, that he just wanted to forget, that he hadn't been looking for consequences. He could have repeated that people go to clubs voluntarily, that both of them had chosen it. But none of those words erased the fact that later he had become Leo's doctor, for someone he had already touched in another way, and he'd kept that truth to himself. All he had left now were his actions. The treatment he continued, the care he didn't stop providing, the decisions he now made not just as an intensivist, but as a specific alpha tied to Leo by their child. Leo, meanwhile, was only beginning to grasp the scale of what had been uncovered. His life before the crash now felt like a thin film stretched over another reality. There, he had been a tired Omega who thought of himself as pretty careful. Here, he was a man with a life growing inside him from the alpha sitting across the room, an alpha who could have been a monster exploiting the situation, but instead had turned his own home into a ward and himself into a round-the-clock nurse. There was still no simple moral label for any of it. You could call it a mistake. You could call it fate. You could call it a chain of irresponsible choices they now had to answer for. But whatever name Leo gave it inside, one thing was clear. This truth was here to stay. It lived under his skin in every kick from within, in every breath he took while leaning on the man across from him. And now both of them had to decide what to do with that truth. The pregnancy reached its late term quietly, without big dramatic peaks, but against the background of heavy internal work. After Leo learned the truth, he went through it all: searing shock, anger, the urge to run anywhere, as long as it wasn't this apartment or this doctor. Then came burnout, when he didn't have the strength to either hate or thank. And only on top of that, very slowly, grew a tired but clear acceptance. The past couldn't be rewritten, but he could choose what to do with what they had now. They never talked about it in long speeches. Both knew the value of words too well. Sometimes Leo would just say, "I'm scared," and that was enough for Elias to rearrange his plans, review treatment schemes, call in yet another specialist. Sometimes it was the other way around. The doctor admitted he wasn't sure Leo could take another push, and then the Omega would answer stubbornly, almost angrily, "After everything I've been through, I can take a little more." Between these short phrases lay hours of silence, where each was alone with their thoughts, but neither of them pretended any more that this was simple. By the time they neared the due date, their lives were full of specifics: blood tests, ultrasounds, case conferences. Given Leo's brain injury, the coma, and the not great state of his vessels, the team cautiously leaned toward a planned C-section. The risk that a natural birth would become a trial his body simply couldn't handle was too high. The decision wasn't made overnight. They went over every line of protocol with him, explaining each risk. In the end, Leo agreed, not because he trusted the paperwork, but because behind that paperwork were people who had already dragged him back to a place where he could make choices again. Returning to the clinic felt like a circle closing. The same hallways, the same lights, even the same smell: antiseptic, vending machine coffee, and lives hanging between floors. Only now Leo didn't come in as a nameless victim on a stretcher, but on his own feet, holding the handrail, with Elias beside him. On his wrist, a band with his name, no longer unidentified Omega in the chart. In his belly, the weight of the baby whose movements sometimes literally took his breath away. The team for the surgery was chosen carefully: an anesthesiologist, an obstetrician, a neonatologist, another surgeon Elias trusted. He himself had ruled out taking the operator's role from the start. It was his conscious step back. He understood he couldn't be just a doctor here, and it was more honest to leave the scalpel in hands not tied to the patient the way his were. His job now was different: to ensure they had everything they needed, to be there in case something went wrong, and to hold up under it as a man, not just as a physician. The night before the surgery, they spent in a pre-op room. Leo barely slept. He lay on his back, listening to his own breathing and the occasional sounds of the clinic outside the door. At some point, he felt the mattress dip under someone else's weight. Elias sat down in the chair by the bed, didn't switch on the light, didn't read charts. He just sat there and breathed next to him. That simple presence made it a little easier, despite everything between them. Morning hit too abruptly. The door opening, footsteps, the practiced, quiet voices of nurses. The prep for surgery felt to Leo like it belonged to someone else's life. The catheter, the cold sweep of antiseptic, the hiss of oxygen in the mask. He tried to hold one thought in his mind. This wasn't punishment and not payback. It was a crossing. On the other side of it, something would be there. Someone would be tiny, alive. Someone who already knew his heartbeat without ever seeing his face or the walls around him. The OR looked just like in his blurred memories. Bright lights, metal instruments, voices exchanging short instructions. A drape cut his view off from his lower body. That was both terrifying and merciful. At some point, the world shrank down to pressure on his chest and a strange pulling sensation that was hard to call pain, but easy to call intrusion. He heard the obstetrician calmly say something about the time. A little farther off, Elias's familiar timbre, checking equipment even though someone else was formally responsible for that now. Professional reflexes held him even here, and then, through all the noise and rustling, came the sound that gave this entire story its meaning. The baby's first cry split the room in two. Before that cry, there had only been struggle, for consciousness, for breath, for numbers on screens. After it, a new starting point appeared. The sound was sharp, indignant, as if the child was protesting the very fact of being born. Leo held his breath, then felt a tear slide down his cheek, not from pain, from the realization that the voice he'd heard for weeks only as a rapid beat on a monitor had finally spoken for itself. They showed him the baby only for a second, before passing him to the neonatologist. A small, crumpled face, damp dark hair, tightly clenched fists. Just another newborn to the staff, but to him, the center of the universe. Leo had time to think just one word: alive, and only then did his body let itself sink into the soft gray haze of medication. For Elias, those minutes stretched out into something close to eternity. He stood by the monitors, watching two lines at once, Leo's vitals and the tiny new graph in the neonatologist's hands. He saw the baby's breathing stabilize, the lips turn a healthier pink, the small body switch on all the right systems. Every steady number meant as much to him as a good outcome in the hardest surgery, but unlike the OR, where he was godlike, here he felt painfully vulnerable, a father who had no right to interfere until he was sure everything was going as it should. When they moved Leo to the recovery room, the baby was brought in a bit later. The staff followed protocol to the letter: exam, scores, all the procedures. Only then did they finally let the tiny body lie where it had essentially lived all those months, on Leo's chest. The baby protested at first, sniffled, waved his hand in the air, but once he buried his face in the familiar scent, he calmed down abruptly. His breathing evened out. The crying turned into soft snuffling. It looked like he had simply found the source of that rhythm he'd heard from the inside. Elias stood by the wall, slightly to the side so he wouldn't get in the way. He watched Leo's body, still weak, still shaking from anesthesia and exhaustion, curl protectively around the baby on instinct, watched the fingers that had clung to the bedrail for months now, gently supporting the soft back of his head. At some point, Leo looked up and met his eyes. There was no "thank you" and no accusation in that look. Just a simple fact. The three of them were bound together now, whether they liked it or not. The formal side didn't take long to show up. The next day, an admin clerk came into the room with a stack of forms. They had to decide whose name the baby would be registered under, who the legal guardian would be, what last name he'd carry. This was the level of reality you couldn't hand over to anyone else. Elias had no right to sign for Leo, no right to decide for him. He left them alone, slipping out into the hallway under the pretext of a call. In truth, he just needed to give Leo space. Leo stared at the paperwork for a long time, at the empty line next to father, at his own last name that still felt tied to his old life. He could have written only himself, could have made the baby his and his alone. He could have put a dash in the father box so the boy would grow up with no official tie to the man who had once set this whole chain of events off. But the last months wouldn't let him take the easy route. He remembered not just the night at the club, he remembered the white glare of the ICU, the mix of strangers' voices where one was always calmer than the rest. Remembered the apartment that had become a ward, the warm palm on his stomach when Elias listened to the heartbeat, sometimes even without a stethoscope. The tired eyes that showed not professional concern, but personal fear for how all this would end. He took the pen and, feeling his hand tremble, wrote Elias's name into the empty field. Not as a reward, not as a neat way to make it all right, but as an acknowledgement of fact. The child had the right to know where he came from, and Leo had the right to demand from this man not just genetics, but presence. When Elias came back, the papers were already stacked. Leo looked exhausted, but there was a new clarity in his face, not heroic, not martyr-like, more like the solidness of someone who had finally stopped drifting. "I'm not giving him to anyone," Leo said. Just one sentence. Without explaining who exactly he meant by anyone, random alphas from his past, a system that had once tried to write him off, or Elias himself. The answer was just as short, and I'm not walking away. No vows, no pretty promises, just a choice spoken aloud. For Leo, it meant he wouldn't be left alone with a newborn and his trauma. For Elias, it meant he could never again hide behind a mask or a white coat. Next, they would have to untangle the everyday, where they were going to live, how to fit a surgeon's schedule around a newborn's routine, what to tell colleagues and those who still remembered the unidentified Omega from that crash. But all of that was the second layer. The first was 3 simple facts. The baby was born. They were both alive, and each of them had consciously chosen to stay. That night, when the clinic finally quieted down and the footsteps in the hallway turned soft and rare, the room filled with new sounds. Not the beeps of monitors, not the whisper of machines, but the gentle breathing of a baby in a clear cot right by Leo's bed. Elias sat in a chair by the window, and for the first time in a very long while, let himself not think about protocols or tomorrow's surgeries. Leo looked at the child and felt something inside finally level out, not become perfect, just stop swinging from side to side. This tiny person knew nothing about the club, about the coma, about the mask on the shelf. For him, everything began here, with the smell of skin, with a voice murmuring something soothing, and with the presence of 2 hearts beating very close by. The birth became a dot, but not a period at the end of a sentence, more like a heavy comma after which both of them understood. From here on, they'd be writing the story not as doctor and patient, not as a random club encounter, but as 2 people who, having once made a mess, still managed to choose the right thing. For the Channel BL story of love, this story entered its quietest, but most important, part at the moment when there were no more sirens, no screens flashing, no gurneys rattling down hospital floors. The time after the birth was unlike anything that had come before. There were no big dramas, sharp turns, or shocking revelations. Instead, there was something else. Long, thick days where every movement, every breath, every look became a small brick in something they both called different names, but meant the same thing, a shared life. Leo recovered slowly. His body, after the crash, brain surgery, rehab, coma, and C-section, felt like a house after a storm. Somewhere it still let in drafts, some walls held together almost out of stubbornness alone, but the foundation had survived. He had to get used to himself all over again, to the scars, to the new heaviness in his lower back, to how fast exhaustion rolled over him if he stood by Evan's crib for just a little too long. In the first weeks, he barely left Evan's side. At night, when the raspy baby cry cut through the room, Leo got up before Elias even had time to wake. His hands shook from weakness but moved precisely. The same body that once had to learn again how to walk and hold a spoon was now learning how to hold a baby so he wouldn't choke on his own breath or get scared. Sometimes Leo whispered to himself in the dark, "I can do this," the same way he'd once whispered it during rehab, taking his first step from the bed to the door. Elias's apartment changed almost without them noticing. Where perfectly aligned books had stood before, there were now soft toys and folded blankets. On the smooth table, which used to know nothing but neat stacks of medical files, there were always bottle rings, empty packs of diapers, crumbs from late-night snacks. In the bathroom, next to his perfectly pressed robe, hung a tiny towel with ears. A home built for one person was quietly learning to hold the noise and rhythm of 3. The relationship between Leo and Elias didn't turn into some sudden shining fairy tale. There was no magical morning where all the hurt dissolved and left only pink fog behind. Their bond was more like a surgical stitch after a difficult operation. No matter how skillfully it was done, it still needed rest and time for the tissue to knit, not tear open again at the first sharp movement. Leo learned to trust not through words but through actions. He watched Elias carefully in everyday life, not in the bright moments where it's easy to be noble, but in the small ones. In the morning, rush before a shift. In the middle of the night when the baby wakes up for the 3rd time in an hour because of colic. In how the alpha reacted not to gratitude and warm emotions, but to Leo's irritation, fear, and helplessness. Every time Elias didn't turn away, didn't hide behind the dry doctor mask, but stayed close and present, it added one more invisible piece to the common ground between them. Elias, in turn, had to learn how to let go of control. For someone used to holding human lives in his hands and making decisions in minutes, It was terrifying to admit there were areas where he wasn't all-powerful. He couldn't erase Leo's memory of the club. He couldn't rewrite the story of the crash. He couldn't protect them from curious looks and questions that would eventually come. But he could be the one who, coming home after a long shift, didn't just fall face down on the bed, but got up for the baby and calmly changed a diaper, even if his own hands were still trembling from overwork. He no longer went to clubs in a mask. Not because he was afraid of a new scandal or some punishment from fate. The need for that kind of escape simply disappeared. Where before he needed noise to drown out the roar inside his own head, now simpler sounds were enough. Evan's wet little snuffles as he searched for a comfy position on Leo's chest, Leo's soft mumbling in the kitchen, the hush of pages turning while the baby slept in his arms. The legal part of their story didn't go anywhere. They still had to deal with forms, signatures, and questions from people who looked at them through a lens of rules and risk assessments. Official recognition of paternity, Leo's legal status, joint registration of their address, potential visits from committees used to labeling any non-standard family as a risk case. At every step, the system tried to push them back into its familiar boxes, but inside those boxes they were already building their own architecture. The main thing was the vow neither of them ever said on camera or wrote on paper. It formed out of many small promises they made, and then immediately tested with action, not disappearing without explanation, not making big decisions behind the other's back, not using the child as a weapon in arguments, not hiding behind professional roles when the matter was personal. This vow didn't have a beautiful Latin name, but it weighed no less than the one Elias once recited in medical school. Leo slowly stopped seeing himself only as a victim. The journey from that night on the wet strip of highway to evenings where he stood by the window, confidently holding his son and listening to the city noise, was far too long to reduce him to one role. He could see how often he'd had to make choices himself, agreeing to the risk of surgery, fighting for the right to stay in the clinic instead of being written off as a social bed, choosing whether to write Elias's name into the child's documents. Each yes and each no gave him back pieces of what fate had tried to take away, the feeling that he was still the author of his own story. Evan grew up with no idea how heavy everything was before he arrived. For him, the world wasn't divided into before and after, only into near and far. Near were two voices with different timbres but the same reliability. Two pairs of hands, each with its own way of holding him, two scents soaked so deeply into his memory that even as an adult he would recognize them in a crowd without thinking about how. His story didn't start with the glossy picture they show in commercials, but with a truth built from mistakes, fear, and stubborn work on themselves. For the BL Story of Love channel, this story sounds like a reminder that one impulsive night can shatter two lives at once. But that doesn't mean nothing new can be built from the pieces. It's about a doctor who spent his life saving others and eventually had to save himself from his own cowardice and habit of hiding behind masks. And about an Omega who, even from the most vulnerable position, still wins back his right to decide who is allowed near his body, his home, and his child. In the evenings, when Evan was already asleep, the apartment filled with a special kind of quiet. Not the sterile silence of intensive care, but a living, warm one. Outside, cars drove past. A distant siren wailed. Somewhere upstairs, somebody's door slammed. Inside, all you could hear were two breaths on the couch and a steady third one, snuffling from the nursery. In those moments, Elias sometimes caught himself silently repeating the old oath he knew by heart and adding new lines of his own. Do no harm, yes. But also, don't run, don't lie. Don't hide behind your role when what they need from you is a person. If you've listened to this story to the end, tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest. The night in the club, the apartment turned into a hospital room, the moment of truth, or the birth of Evan and their new life together. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story. And remember, even if your fate once depended on someone else's choices, you still have the right to decide who you'll be in your own story and who you'll trust with your heart.